I think we're ready to begin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Amy Smarodin. I'm a member of the ICCT comms team. Thanks for attending today's webinar on vehicle replacement programs as an economic response to the COVID crisis. The webinar is being recorded, and we'll send out a link to the recording to everyone that participated sometime next week. Today's presentation will last about 15 minutes. Afterwards, we'll have additional 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. Everyone's microphone is currently on mute. So if you have a question, please write them in the question block that's in the control panel at the right side of your screen. And I'll be collecting these questions throughout the presentation. Today's webinar on green vehicle replacement programs will be presented by Georg Beeker. Georg is a researcher at the ICCT whose work focuses on the real-world emissions and fuel consumption of passenger cars in Europe. He also has a background in battery research and supports our work on electric vehicles. But before we begin, Peter Mock, ICCT's EU Managing Director, is going to give a brief overview of the topic. Peter?
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you very much to everyone for joining. The COVID-19 crisis came to all of us as a shock, and it has huge implications not only from the health perspective, but also from an economic perspective. Here in Europe, the vehicle sales dropped significantly. In April, we had about 80% less new car registrations than typically, or than we had in 2019. And there were markets such as Italy where basically no vehicles were sold at all. In Italy, in April, it was about 4,000 new vehicles registered, which is really nothing compared to the usual figures. In the meantime, at least here in Europe, the health situation seems to have improved. Life feels more normal again. And also the vehicle sales are increasing again, they're going up again. So to cite against Italy, going from 4,000 new cars in April, we had 100,000 new cars in May, which is quite a recovery. Nevertheless, the vehicle sales remain low compared to previous numbers, and many governments at the moment ask themselves the question, what can we do in order to help the automotive industry specifically, but also the industry in general and the economic situation in general, to catch up and to recover. In an ideal world, this recovery and these recovery programs that are being discussed at the moment combine not only economic aspects, but also environmental aspects, and ideally help us to meet both targets, to improve the economic situation again, to help the industry, to help the economy in general, and also to decarbonize vehicles, reduce emissions, and prepare us for the upcoming climate change problems that we are facing. From ICCT side, we published a paper at the end of May that looked at green vehicle replacement programs, how they could be looking like, how they could be drafted. And today, my colleague Georg Beeker will focus on that paper and provide some more insights, some key results from that paper. And we are looking forward to an interesting discussion afterwards, and hope that from the European perspective, we can maybe provide also some thoughts or some indications for other countries around the world that are still facing a very tough health situation at the moment, whereas here in Europe, I think we are basically making a bit more progress at the moment and might share some insights already. With these words, I hand over to Georg, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Peter and Amy, for the nice introduction. I will just directly start with the first word, so green. The question is, what makes a vehicle replacement program green? And here you can see two different scenarios. One is the business as usual. And here you would assume that the car is driven in Europe like for 18 years until it is scraped and then replaced by a new one. And now with the vehicle replacement program, this process is sped up. So a car is already like scraped after 15 years, for instance. And then it is replaced earlier by a new car. But to make these programs green, there are three conditions that have to be fulfilled. The first one is that the new car is actually emits less than the old car. This is in terms of CO2, but also in terms of pollutant emissions. Then the second aspect, and this is also very important, is that the new car emits less than the car that would be bought otherwise if there would be no program. And this is a very important aspect that is usually not considered. that it matters if you like support people buying an average car in Germany right now, for instance, but at the same time making people not buying the same car in 2 or 3 years, which are potentially more ecologic than they are now. So this aspect is also very important, not only looking directly at the old and new car, but also at the counterfactual, the car that would be bought otherwise. And then the third aspect is that we have to look at the emissions that occur during the production of the new car, at least for a proportionate amount. So if you would replace a car 3 years, for instance, earlier, you would also need to account for some part of the production emissions. And in the following, I want to show you the impact of vehicle replacement programs in 3 different variations. The first is if you would just allow people to buy an average car or support the replacement of an old car by an average new car. Then second, to support people in replacing their old car by an efficient new car, which is according to the European CO2 target. And the third option is to incentivize people in replacing their old car by battery electric cars. So coming to the first aspect, here you can see the greenhouse gas emissions of new car registrations in Germany over time. And you can see 3 colors of the bar. So below you have the official, the type approval CO2 emissions. And here you can see that they decreased from 2001 to 2017-18. And this is because of the EU legislation and the EU CO2 target. Then you have a change of the testing procedure. So from 2018 to 2019, the testing procedure changed from NEDC to WLTP, and this results in higher official CO2 levels. Then you see the second layer, and these are the real world CO2 emissions of cars. And you can see that they almost completely balance out the effect of the decreased official CO2 emissions. And then you can see the third aspect that is also important, the greenhouse gas emissions that are related to fuel production. This is another about 20% that needs to be added when looking at the whole greenhouse gas emissions of driving cars. And here you can see that when looking at all these factors, driving a 2020 average car is not that much better than driving an old car from 2001 or 2005, for instance. And so here's the first variation of such a program in Germany, where you would just incentivize the replacement of an old car, for instance, from 2005. This would be a 15-year-old car by an average new car from 2020. And here, now you also see this red bar added, and this is for the vehicle production. You see it's not that much, but it makes a small difference, especially in this case, because you can see that the new car is, as I said, does not emit that much less than the car that is replacing. But here, most importantly, it does not show an improvement compared to cars that would be bought in the next years. And then the third aspect, so here we assume that the next years the car will have the same CO2 levels as right now. This is a conservative estimation. And according to the EU fleet regulations, it's pretty likely that they will decrease in the next years. Yeah, and then you can see here the effect of the production, and due to this effect, in the end, the emissions are even higher than if you would not have such a program. And this is the second variation. Here you would replace a car from the year 2005 by a new car with CO2 emissions of 110 gram per kilometer. This is in WLTP and refers to the European target of 95 gram in NEDC. And here you can see that the emissions are lower than the old car and also lower than for the car that would be bought in Germany, at least in the next years. And you can also see that the emission savings are much higher than the emissions that are needed to produce this new car earlier. So in the end, for Germany, you would save about 28% of the CO2 emissions for such a program. And then the third variation of the program would be to limit the vehicle replacement program for new battery electric vehicle. And here the effect is even much stronger. Here you would save 62%. As you can maybe see, the bar is getting a bit thicker, because for battery electric cars you need a bit more, or you emit a bit more for the production, but it doesn't make really a difference. In this case, looking at the actual emissions of driving. Yeah, you can see that this savings of 62, you can see it later on in the European comparison, is not that high compared to other countries, because in Germany we have a comparably high carbon intense power supply. But still, you can see that the CO2 emission savings are highest when replacing only supporting battery electric vehicles. Here you see an overview of different European countries. There are a lot of numbers on this table, but I only want to point you to the one that are marked, and these make the effect of the different programs. So you see in the you see here in the second column on the left, you see the emissions of driving an average 2020 car, and next to it you can see the effect, just as mentioned before, of replacing an old 2005 car by a new car from 2020. And you can see that in Germany there are actually some increase of the emissions, and in Spain or France, for instance, there are also no really positive effect on CO2 emissions. And then when you see the second case, replacing an old car by a new one that emits only 110 gram CO2 per kilometer in WLTP, you can see that the relative effect is comparably high in Germany. Here you have 28% savings, but in other countries like France or Spain, where the fleet is below the average of the European fleet, you can see that this effect is much lower. In Germany, we have one of the highest CO2 emissions of the new car fleets in the European comparison, and therefore, like, limiting the emissions to an absolute value makes the highest impact. Yeah, and in other countries, maybe also looking at Italy, you can see that the effect will not be that high. So also here, when putting very strong regulations and only allowing the replacement by these efficient combustion engine cars, you would still have only a low effect on CO2 emissions. Then the third option is, again, battery electric vehicles. You can see in this column, the second from the right, you can see how different the greenhouse gas emissions of driving electric vehicles are in different European countries. You can see Greece, or you can also see Germany, with comparably high numbers, because the carbon intensity is pretty high for the electricity mix. But then it's the other countries like France or Sweden, where you have a low carbon intensity of the grid, and accordingly you see that the effect of or that the emissions of battery electric vehicles are lower in these countries. So in Germany you have like 62% savings, whereas in France this is a value of up to 92%. So in most European countries, the positive effect of replacing old cars by battery electric vehicles is higher. And then there's a second aspect, not only looking at greenhouse gas emissions, but also at pollutant emissions. And here you can see the development of NOx emissions of new diesel cars registered in Germany in the last 20 years. And you can see once again, the dark bars represent the official emission limit. So this is what these cars are allowed to emit during the test. And you can see the bars above. These are like what these cars emit in real world conditions. And here you can see that it's much higher than what they are actually allowed to emit in the type approval test. Yeah, but you also can see that since several years, so especially with the introduction of Euro 60 temp Euro standard in 2019, you can see that this gap went down a lot. So there used to be a huge gap between real world and laboratory values in the past, but this decreased a lot. And accordingly, we have a certain benefit in NOx emissions in like pulling forward the replacement of these old highly emitting cars by new cleaner ones. But the effect is less than one might think, because you would need to replace the old cars by the new ones in the next years anyways. Starting from next year, the Euro 60 standard will be mandatory all over Europe anyways. And also, that's also an aspect that has to be considered here. You could also retrofit the old cars. In the case of diesel cars, you could retrofit them with a selective catalytic reduction equipment, or also with particulate filters, and thereby also decrease the emissions. And this might be in the end a cheaper alternative. But like the final point on this slide is that battery electric vehicles refer to zero local NOx emissions. So also in this case, battery electric vehicles have the highest environmental benefit. Here you can see the situation for gasoline cars, and the picture is very clear, especially because the scale is the same as was kept the same as for diesel cars. You can see that the gap between the official and the real world emission levels are not that big, and in general you see that the emissions are not that high. So for gasoline cars, there's not that much benefit of vehicle replacement programs. And again, if you would replace the old cars by battery electric vehicles, or any combustion engine car by battery electric vehicles, you would save most pollutant emissions. With this, I come to the results of this part. So for CO2 emissions, you can see that the effect is very low, or even not existent, if you would allow to replace the old cars by average new cars. So you need to put some limits. Yeah, and if this limit is like 110 gram according to WLTP, which is like 95% in NEDC, you would have some small CO2 emission savings. But this is not a big deal, considering the high costs you would face with these programs. Then at the third point, you can see that the battery electric cars have the highest CO2 emission savings, and the same is true for local pollutant emissions. So green vehicle replacement programs should focus on battery cars. There's another industrial economic aspect to this, that when the aim of recovery plans is to support the automotive industry, one should keep in mind that there are penalties that could occur from the CO2 regulation of the European Union. And these recovery plans should help the automotive industry to avoid these penalties. But most importantly, and also looking forward, is that recovery plans should take the chance to support the automotive industry in its transition to electric vehicles. And here especially like try to keep the automotive industry keeping pace with the global EV production. In the end, I want to show you some examples of recovery plans in Germany, including vehicle replacement programs. So on this slide, you see France, Germany, and Spain, and two different kind of measures. One is the purchase premium on electric vehicles. For this, no scrappage of an old car is required. And here you can see that all three countries increased the support of buying new electric vehicles. It's up to 7,000 euro in France, 6,000 euro in Germany, and 4,000 euro in Spain for battery electric vehicles. And for plug-in electric vehicles, the support is significantly lower in France, and whereas in Spain, for instance, you would have the same amount of support, at least when the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle has a certain electric range. And then this was the topic of today's presentation: vehicle replacement programs, thus programs that require the scrappage of an old car, have not been introduced in Germany, to start with this, whereas in France it was introduced, and here you would get, for battery electric cars and for plug-in electric vehicles, you would get another 5,000 euro if you would also trade in an old car. But also the French government introduced a scrappage scheme for that also supports new combustion engine cars with up to 3,000 euro. But there are several conditions that limit this aspect. So first of all, it's only for people that earn less than 18,000 euro per year. But then it's also restricted to cars emitting less than 137 grams per kilometer in WLTP. And it's limited to 200,000 cars, I think. So the effect of this program in France might be not that high, but still, looking at this number of 137 grams per kilometer, when you keep in mind that the numbers I showed before, you don't have a big impact for 110 grams per kilometers, but for 137 grams per kilometers in France, you would have even an increase of CO2 emissions compared to the first case of the average car. In Spain, the Spanish government also introduced a vehicle, so additional 1,500 euro if you would replace an old car by a new battery or plug-in electric vehicle. And they are still discussing on a vehicle replacement program that also supports the purchase of new and more efficient conventional cars. So with this, I would like to finish. Thank you for joining today. And if you have further questions, feel free to contact me directly by email or ask me questions now. Thank you.
We do have time for a couple questions. If anyone in the audience would like to ask some, there is a box in your control panel. You can type them in and I will get them to Georg. But until then, I do have a couple questions for you. How does your methodology deviate from other studies?
Mm-hmm.
To earlier studies on 2009 vehicle replacement in Germany?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this mostly relates to what I showed on the first slide, that you have these three conditions for a green program. And you do not only have to look at the direct effect of replacing the old by the new car, and this is what many studies do. You also have to consider the effect of not buying cars or more efficient cars later.
We do have a question from the audience too. Are electric vehicles also better with coal-intensive power supply?
Mm-hmm. Yes, they are. Like I showed the slide for here, for instance, you can see Greece, which has like 500 grams per kilowatt hour as carbon intensity, which is pretty carbon intensive. But in Europe, there are other countries with like Poland, for instance, which has about 900 gram CO2 per kilowatt hour. But even in these countries, you see a benefit. For sure, it's lower than in countries with a lower carbon intensity of power supply. but you still have the benefit. And what is also important to note that this will change in next years. So if you buy a car now, you will run it like for 18 years. And if you buy a combustion engine car now, it will have the same emissions for the next 18 years. But if you would buy a battery electric vehicle now, the carbon intensity of the power supply would decrease, and therefore you would improve your carbon footprint every year.
What was the impact on CO2 emissions in programs during the global financial crisis?
Yeah, this depends a lot on the program. For the German program, for instance, there was no threshold put on CO2 emissions, so you could just buy any new car and get the funding. And accordingly, this refers pretty much to the first case where you would just replace the old car by an average new car. Accordingly, you didn't see greenhouse gas emission savings. We did this calculation also in the briefing, so if you're interested, you can also look the numbers up here. But when you look at other programs like the French or the Spanish program, you had a higher effect on CO2 emissions, so you would have higher savings because you would have savings because here it was restricted. There was a threshold on CO2 emissions. Yeah, therefore it was more like in the second case.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Did former vehicle replacement programs improve air quality?
Yes, I want to show you this slide here. So you can see that if you would do a vehicle replacement program in 2009 or 10, you see that the NOx emission levels here, same might be true for particulate matter emissions. You have for diesel cars not that high. No, to put it the other way, you have very high real-world emissions, although the official values are lower. When you compare like a car that was registered in 2009 with a car registered in 2001, for instance, you would, from the paper, you would say that you would have maybe half of the emissions only. But when you look at the real-world emissions, you see that the savings were much less. Accordingly, the impact of earlier programs was much lower than usually estimated.
Okay, it looks like that's all we have time for. If you have additional questions, anyone in the audience, feel free to contact Georg directly. And we will be sending out a recording of this webinar probably next week sometime. So thank you everyone for attending and have a good day.